I'd like to welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to the new school. This is the second event we have in this series we organize with SoFAB Institute, the Southern Food and Beverage Institute.
No, it's just SoFAB.
Oh, just SoFAB. All right, it's just SoFAB. And Liz Williams will explain more about it. I just wanted to say a few words about what we do here in the new school if you are new or coming for the first time. We started our program more or less in 2008, and now we have developed into a full-on major, minor, and starting from the fall 2015, fall 2015, yes. We also have an associate degree. It's just been approved by the state, so we're building it, and that will allow the possibility for people who want to be more professionally oriented or for career changers to do a 2-year degree. And we're working on other projects, including Masters in Food and Design in Paris that will be launched in 2016. So we're very happy about these developments, and we're working on a graduate certificate here on global food system and social justice. So lots of projects from the teaching point of view. What's interesting is that most of our undergraduate classes are open to the general public for continuing education. And that for us has always been very enriching. I just came from a class I was teaching across the courtyard where we do have professionals taking the class for continuing education, and they bring a lot to the class besides receiving it. As professors, it's interesting because basically you have to learn that you're not probably the expert any longer. You're in a conversation, and that makes it very interesting. So if you're interested in courses, just leave your name and we'll make sure to send announcement about classes. We also have series of public events. The next one will be on November 10th here in this room, and will be about sustainability in the wine industry. So it will be a little more technical, less cultural, but they're doing a lot of work in Europe on that, and we want to present what's being done there and allow American professionals and experts, wine experts, to discuss and see if it's applicable or not. I think it's going to be quite interesting. That event is not free. It's $15, but there will be wine, quite a bit of it, and good wine, and food. We also try to connect to the public, as in the mission of our university, through our website. It's called The Inquisitive Eater, inquisitiveeater.com. If you've never seen it, check it out. We accept and actually solicit submissions from anybody, and it can be poetry or images or design or painting. We really we're working to make this a place for exchange among people working in the food community. So look at it, and if you have some stories that you want to share or some fantastic pictures that you've kept in your, little thumb drive, please send them to us. So I would have now Liz present tonight's program. I'm going to sit down because I'm also one of the speakers. By the way, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Fabio Parasecoli, and I'm now Director of Food Studies Initiatives here at the New School between New York and Paris. And actually in the back we have the new chair of Food Studies, Bibanyu. If anybody's interested in courses, she is the person to talk to. And now, Liz, please.
Thank you, Fabio. I want to welcome all of you to the New School and to thank the New School for being our partner once again. This is our second year doing this, Culinaria Query, and it's kind of exciting to feel like it's happening again. I really want to tell you a little bit about what the Culinaria Query is for the SoFAB Institute. We initiated this project last year where we asked the question, is food art? So we asked that question And we repeated the question in panels and in talks all around the country. And so this year, our question for 2014 is, can we reset the family table? And so the whole point is to see what people say around the country, what differences there are, how our attitudes are different from place to place. And it's a really interesting exercise to go from one place to another, raising exactly the same question and seeing how different people and different locations respond to the question. So at the SoFAB Institute, we have a division which we call the Southern Food and Beverage Museum. That sounds backwards because we really started out being the Southern Food and Beverage Museum, and then we became the SoFAB Institute. We like to tell people that it's kind of like Federal Express became FedEx. So we were the Southern Food and Beverage Museum and called ourselves SoFAB. And then we realized that we were doing so many other things. We had library, we had these projects around the country, we were doing policy analysis in Washington, D.C., we were doing all sorts of things. And so we became the SoFAB Institute. And it's not the Southern Food and Beverage Institute, just the SoFAB Institute. But our sort of landmark project is the Southern Food and Beverage Museum. And we reopened recently on September 29th. And we closed and moved ourselves into our own building. And in our new building, we have all the things that we always wanted. We have a demonstration kitchen. We have a restaurant and bar. We hope that when we say that we're the only museum in the country that allows you to eat and drink in the museum, that we're not lying. We think that it's really true. And I can tell you that we went through a lot of trash cans trying to find the right trash can for all of the galleries in the museum, because most museums don't have trash cans. They don't want you to have access. Anyway, one of the things we did when we opened was we created this very large banquet table. And on the table, we piled all sorts of artifacts representing the food of Louisiana. And it makes you think then about the family table and what it could mean, and whether we even need to reset the family table, and whether we're asking a question that has meaning, is it meaningless, whatever. So there have been a lot of studies, and some of the studies have determined that there are many benefits that come from people eating together, families eating together around the table. Sometimes I think it's interesting to determine whether these are true correlations, whether there's causation, if it's only correlations and there's real causation there. Can we actually pass on traditions, culture, even civilization itself in any other way? Is our belief that a family meal as a good thing is really just a nostalgic delusion? Has there really never been a time when everyone had a family meal? Is eating on the run something that many cultures actually consider routine? And our desire to stop that and tell people not to eat in their cars or on their way to soccer games or whatever, is that a meaningful kind of consideration? So are we overthinking this? Do we overeat because we aren't actually satisfied with the experience of eating because we're eating on the run without actually mindfully doing it? And probably the question that seems the most relevant to me is, do we make these decisions in answering those questions based on our own experience growing up around a family table or not? So I would like to ask you to consider those things while I introduce our panelists. Now, there are some wonderful biographies of our panelists on the back of this sheet, So I'm not going to introduce them by reading those biographies. I'm just going to tell you who they are. So first we have Fabio, and then after him we have Meryl Rosofsky. Meryl is a physician and writer and adjunct professor in the Department of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health at NYU. Then we have Krishnendu Ray. He is associate professor and chair of the Department of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health at NYU. And he's author of The Migrant's Table, Meals and Memoirs in Bengali-America, in Bengali-American households. And also, there is Ava Chin, who is Associate Professor of Creative Writing and Journalism at the City University of New York. And she is author of Eating Wildly, Foraging for Life, Love, and the Perfect Meal. So I turn it over, and we're going to ask each of them to make a statement, and then we'll start discussing some of these questions. Fabio?
So I'll tackle the issue more from a historical point of view. In 2012, I finished working as co-editor on a 6-volume cultural history of food. And in each of the volume, we had discussions about families and households and how food was managed and cooked and consumed. So I would like to share, all the information that that we gathered. It was a group, an international group of scholars, more or less 45 scholars from all over the world. Before going there, although I must admit that I did grow up in a family where the family meal was very important, both on a weekly basis. We would wait for our father to come back from work at 2 p.m., 2:30 p.m. I'm from Italy. 2:30 p.m. is a normal time to eat.
Such a surprise with a name like that.
Right? But also the Sunday meals were very important, and that's something that I found here in Italian-American communities. So there is something there that is very important. But if you start going back in time, you realize that the family meal was not the norm. Absolutely not. Eating together with other people was not about family, was about social connections, was about politics, was about economics. If you look at the Etruscans or the Romans or the Greeks, they did eat together. They invited people over, but it was not with the family. Very often the families would not eat together. People would eat depending on the needs, and the meals, the shared meals, were part of more social gatherings. Very often women were not even admitted to the meals. The Etruscans did, and for that they got a very bad rap in ancient Italy, because women were really not supposed to be sitting at the table with the man. And over time we see that people ate when they needed to eat, depending on their activities, what they were doing. Only the upper classes actually had the luxury to get together and eat. But it was not necessarily a regular shared activity in the family. Also in upper class families in the Renaissance, for instance, there were no specific dining rooms. There were no such things as dining tables. Most of the time, it was just planks put on trestles, and they would put a tablecloth on when they came up with the tablecloths. Before that, not even tablecloths. And then they would break everything down at the end of the meal. The fact that there was not a space dedicated to that, or an object dedicated to that, I think it says a lot. We start seeing the development of dining rooms and dining tables, and also specific, beautiful, artistic dining objects precisely after, with the Renaissance and after. But again, it's very limited to the upper classes. Farmers would eat wherever they would be at the moment, at 12. They would probably bring some food from home, very simple food. During the Industrial Revolution, people didn't have time to eat that much, so they would eat something on the go. And very often, in workers' families, they didn't have the possibility of eating together due to economic reasons, to the different schedules. The family meal became so important in the general imagination in Western countries, and I specified Western countries because in other countries still, it's not that relevant. It became important when the bourgeois model of the meal became the norm. So it was part of propriety, of respectability for families to be together. It was also a way to express the fact that they were at a certain social level. And it was a way also for fathers, for men, to express their sort of control over the family. Keep in mind that very often those families had help. So it was not just women cooking, they had people coming into the house and cooking for them. So over time, this experience that was shared in the bourgeois environment became sort of the norm also for other classes that wanted somehow to repeat that experience. It was a way to better themselves, to achieve something, to perform a social identity that they were inspiring to. So I think that created the transition at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th. And then before World War II and during World War II, actually government started pushing this idea of the family meal. In totalitarian countries was the fact of somehow controlling the life of the family through the meals. For instance, in Italy, the fascist government published specific cookbooks and recipes and guides for women to make sure that they use the food in the right way, especially in moments when food was hard to get by. And they wanted to reinforce the family as the basic structure of the Italian empire. The same thing happened, for instance, in Japan or in Germany. But also in the US, we see with the Victory Gardens, women take a very important role in bringing the war effort into the daily life. And at that point, the family meal became very important. At the end of the war, some problems started, occurring. Men were coming back and they wanted jobs, the jobs that women had been doing during the war, and women were somehow pushed back into the kitchens. But at the same time, you have convenience foods, industrial food. So it was the idea that, yes, women were supposed to be the center of the family, take care of the family, cook, show their affection through food, but at the same time, they had products to make it shorter. So you would have canned meat, and you would have, different appliances that would help you cut on the time. And that created tension, because how do I express my affection and my role as a woman if cooking is an important part of that? If I cut corners, am I still a good housewife? Am I still a good mother? And then, the 60s came and the 70s came, and, women didn't have time or the desire to be in the kitchen, and that somehow, together with the diffusion of mass-produced foods and convenience foods and fast foods, made the situation that it is as we see it now. But in the meantime, the family meal had crystallized itself as something important, as an institution. So if we look in the grand scheme of things, the family meal has sort of a short history and also limited to specific cultural and geographical environments. But I think my other friends here will have more to say about that and how the family meal can actually have some role in contemporary life.
Hi, everyone. That was absolutely fascinating, hearing more about the history and the background. I'd like to raise the question of whether the family meal is a prescription for health or a recipe for distress. I was asked to lend this perspective because of my training as a physician, but I will say it's not my area of focus, so I certainly welcome and hope to hear perspectives from others here who might be doing research in this area. Now, in looking at the research on the subject, it's helpful to keep in mind one of my favorite maxims from my days as a medical researcher. Any data, if sufficiently tortured, will confess. So let's take a look at some of the confessions. I'd like to start by asking, are we really cooking and eating together less? Here are some recent and really robust data from excellent sources that involve thousands of data points, thousands of young people. These numbers suggest, surprisingly, that most children and teens in the US are eating meals with their families more days than not. Frequency of family meals, as one would expect, does decline with age as kids become adolescents, and it's lower than it was in the 1970s, but it remains impressive nonetheless. And maybe we do need to remain concerned about the 1/3 or so of adolescents who aren't eating regular family meals, but overall, I find these numbers heartening. So why should we be so concerned about whether people are engaging in regular family meals? In our rushed, distracted, technology-driven lives, the family meal has been held out as a cure-all for the modern family's ills. Here we have a quote from Miriam Weinstein's book, The Surprising Truth About Family Meals. A magic bullet, she proclaims. There's a lot to unpack in her statement, and certainly for many, the family meal is neither simple nor affordable. But let's start with the health claims. Lots of studies have in fact shown, as Liz Pressiged in her remarks, that family meals appear to have a protective effect across a range of high-risk behaviors. Frequency of family meals has been shown to correlate with lower odds of alcohol, tobacco, and drug use, depression and suicide, and violence and antisocial behavior like stealing and vandalism. Kids who eat more family meals are also less likely to engage in binge eating, meal skipping, food restriction, and other eating behaviors we would consider disordered. The literature is more mixed on the association with overweight and obesity, but at least some researchers have found lower risk for these two. In addition, family meals correlate positively with psychosocial well-being. Kids who eat more meals together with their families tend to have bigger vocabularies, higher grades, better social skills, closer family bonds, and higher self-esteem. Several studies, including the large Project EAT data out of Minnesota, have found a connection to healthier diets, with kids who report eating regular family meals having higher intakes of fruits, vegetables, and foods rich in calcium and other nutrients, and less intake of soda and fried foods. So what actually happens at the family table? Eating together as a family provides an opportunity to teach our kids social skills and table manners. It's also a forum to transmit family values. Parents also model desired behaviors at the family table.
That's a good one.
Sorry. And family dinners give children a platform to discuss their days, strengthening family bonds and promoting self-esteem. Family dinners help us learn about our own and others' cultural traditions. To take a food studies perspective, family meals, what, when, and how the family eats, are a representation of the ethnic, cultural, and religious heritage of the family. Family meals provide an opportunity to both talk about and participate in family cultural traditions. The family meal is a daily time for the whole family to be together, and that routine gives young children in particular a sense of security and a feeling of belonging. Children thrive on routine and stability, and the rituals of the family table, favorite and symbolic foods, expected roles, expressions of gratitude, can be comforting and increase a youngster's feelings of closeness and connection. So these cartoons that we've just looked at all hint at the subversive and even oppressive nature of family meals. But joking aside, there is a robust and intriguing literature pointing to the myriad benefits of gathering around the family table. Family meals provide an opportunity for increased communication and monitoring and are clearly associated with positive cognitive, social, and health outcomes for children and adolescents. But is the family meal all it's cracked up to be? Is nostalgia giving the family meal a good name it doesn't deserve? It's easy to idealize the family meal, but the reality may be far from the picture we carry from Leave It to Beaver. Could it be that the family that dines together wines together? Sociologists at North Carolina State University recently spent 250 hours conducting ethnographic observations of 12 families. They said that, quote, "We rarely observed a meal in which at least one family member didn't complain about the food they were served." So I mentioned earlier the maxim, any data, if sufficiently tortured, will confess. Could it be that we've gotten a false confession from our data based on how we've sliced and diced it? There's a ton of research showing a correlation between frequency of family meals and positive academic and behavioral outcomes. But as Liz mentioned, correlation doesn't mean causality, and frequency may not be the most important metric, just a convenient one. The family meal could simply be a marker or proxy for other aspects of family life that are positive and protective. Perhaps family meal frequency co-varies with factors like parental education and family resources, and the family meal might just be an innocent bystander. Further, most of the studies have been cross-sectional and observational rather than longitudinal or even experimental. What about randomized controlled trials, the gold standard of research? There are few to none presently. Other issues in the literature are that people often look only at kids or teens and then extrapolate from one to the other. And important aspects like gender, race, ethnicity, and family income are not yet well understood. These variables probably make a significant difference in the practice of family meals and how their impacts are mediated. When you do tease out gender, for example, you find that family meals tend to serve as a greater protective agent for females than for males. So are the benefits of the family meal overstated? Is the family meal truly contributing to the better outcomes observed, or is it just a proxy measure? Here's a provocative finding by researchers from Columbia, NYU, and Boston University based on longitudinal data and a very large, robust data set. They found that when you control for confounding factors like parental employment, family income, TV watching, and quality of school facilities, and then apply rigorous analytic methods, the, quote, effects of family meals on child academic and behavioral outcomes are either small or effectively zero. This is a novel and surprising but robust finding. Quote, families that believe in the importance of eating together might also do lots of other things they feel are good for their kids, the researchers say, like go to the library or be more invested in picking the right schools. But if you look at frequency of family meals, that may seem to be causing positive results. Other recent studies cast further doubts, going so far as to suggest a detrimental effect of family meals in some cases. For example, family meals could be associated with higher rates of depressive symptoms and delinquency in households where family relationships are poor or even toxic. As Ann Meyer of the University of Minnesota says, quote, you can imagine if you have a strained family relationship, regularly gathering together to reenact that strain might not be the best. She has to be British. That's such a wonderful understatement. Clearly, the family table can be a battleground where dysfunctions and disappointments bubble to the surface and are given full expression. We've talked about the impact of the family table on young people's health and well-being, but what about the toll it takes on the parents and caregivers? And the burden, even in dual-career households, still falls disproportionately to women. Moms might rush home from work and toil to put a nutritious, home-cooked meal on the table, only to be on the receiving end of complaints and indifference. And many of us have no doubt read Virginia Heffernan's battle cry this past week in the New York Times, "What if you just hate making dinner?" We're seeing a growing backlash against the advice of the Waters, Pollens, and Bittmans of the world to get back to the stove. As a non-mom, I've had the luxury of cooking out of desire rather than necessity more often than not. But my mom was only too happy to hang up her apron when my dad retired. And I'm sure years of cooking canned peas for my dad and frozen peas for me and my sisters at the same meal fostered a lingering resentment. But surely the family meal story is not all resentment and false assumptions. At a slow food event a couple of weeks ago, Carlo Petrini and Alice Waters extolled the virtues of cooking. Cooking is love, they proclaimed. And Petrini suggested there's something almost sacred about a grandmother's cooking in particular. As my friend Dave Cook said, everyone loves grandmas. Throw in a picture of a grandma. So here we have a picture of a grandma, and who among us wouldn't want to be at a family table with this Italian nonna? Fabio, that's not your grandma's. But sometimes even grandma gets fed up. My own family ate meals together regularly when I was growing up. My dad even coming home from the office for a hot lunch every day. Here we are, gathered for a family meal in the dining room, not the kitchen, so it must have been a special occasion. I'm not quite sure what a nice Jewish family was doing with that painting on the wall, but as I discovered last night, this picture was taken right around the time The Exorcist came out. And my family did have a problem with the devil, which leads me to my conclusion. In evaluating the literature, it's good to remember that the devil's in the details and that a history of good family meals can overcome even a childhood of really bad wallpaper.
That was exquisite. Two exquisite presentations. So what I'm going to do is speak to the question we were given a set of questions, and one of them was, have we romanticized eating together based on false nostalgia? And you saw Fabio's beautiful presentation on that the idealized family meal has a relatively short history and a class address. And you saw Meryl's terrific presentation on the potentialities of it, protective or, in fact, destructive potentialities of a meal, of eating together. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my experience to speak to this kind of two parts to that question, which is, who is this we? And what does this kind of romanticized nostalgia of dinner do to it? Let me start with something academics are warned against saying. I think nostalgia, in fact, is a good sentiment. Because without nostalgia, I won't have roots and a sense of belonging and community. What is, of course, problematic with nostalgia is like the problem with putting bacon in everything. It overwhelms everything else. And so nostalgia in the right amount is in fact productive of memories, even in some ways sanitized. And I'll give you kind of my example of it. Most of my work has been derived from the work amongst immigrants, and which is laced with substantial nostalgia, which is in fact place-making and remaking in some ways. So, and the second thing I want to do is, what I'm doing in the process of telling my story in some ways, is kind of unpacking who the we is. As you heard, the we is very important. And in fact, that's where the devil is in the detail, as to who is the we in terms of class, end of the 19th century, early 20th century, the bourgeoisie, or in terms of when we say the family meal is declining and who it is good for or bad for. So I come from a household, 2 kids, dad, mom. Mom with 8th grade education, stay at home. I'm an immigrant. I came from India. Lower middle class, small town, and slowly climbed the class ladder. And as we did that, we also moved from town to town. My father was a salesman. And we had fantastic meals, at least 2 of them, every day. In the morning, it would be fresh-made chapatis or roti, called in Bengali. My mother is Odia, my father is Bengali. We started off in a small town in eastern India in a state called Odisha, and then I eventually went to high school in Delhi and then college in Delhi. So until I left home for college, basically very good meals, and I have deep nostalgia for it, and my whole life is an attempt to recapture that moment. And I'll show you how that is productive. And the first part of it, I'll show you first how it is unproductive. The first part of it, of course, is how I got to work on food, because when I came to the United States, and I couldn't find Indian food, or at least what I thought was good Indian food. Of course, never ask an expatriate ever what is the good, their national food. It's never anything good, partly because of nostalgia, partly because there's a difference between home cooking and restaurant cooking. There's a real material difference. But what I was absolutely surprised by was that A, I didn't know how to cook. B, that I had not realized that I didn't know how to cook. Was an astounding revelation about my social location. As a lower middle class male in a household where all household work was done by my mother, it had not even occurred to me to think about food, and had enjoyed immense amount of good meals on an everyday basis all the time. Later on, I came to realize that I had been the product of what I have come to call the servant-wife complex of cookery that dominates the world, has dominated in many parts of the world, still dominates India. And in fact, the interesting question in front of us, as Fabio pointed out, has happened in the Western world is, what is going to happen to that food when we no longer have a servant-wife complex of cookery? Are we going to go to convenience food, industrialized food? Are we going to go to street foods like we do in Singapore? So as I said, there is 2 parts to it. My family meals were fantastic. My father was a very caring father, very sensitive, very loving. He, in fact, was the sentimental type in the household, while mom was the disciplinarian. And she cooked and cared, and of course we thanked her, and my dad's made sure we thanked her, but we never learned to do anything. We never learned to do basically care work. So the first part of it is the price of that laboring system, which is heavily female dependent everywhere in the world and exploitative. And there was, now I realize, because now I live in a household, me, my son, and my cat, and I have to cook for him every day. It's a pain in the ass. And I love it, parts of it. I hate parts of it, that my family meal would not work without him, without me working for him, which is, of course, instrumental about thinking about a household in which there are no women. Hence, other than the female, other than the cat. Because of that, I cannot run a household of, in fact, female labor-intensive, nice, nostalgic sentiment. So you see both sides of it. Nostalgia, in fact, is productive of my, as a middle class, lower middle class man, eventually being forced to learn to cook and eventually getting to caregiving. There would be none of that if I did not try to create that nostalgic meal that my mother worked for. But the other part of it is most household meals like that in most parts of the world, especially in South Asia, are massively exploitatively female labor dependent. Both those things are true. I'm that kind of a guy. I think a glass is half full, and I think a glass is half empty, and both of them are true about, and in fact, they're talking about the same fact. Stop there.
Sounds good, yes.
That was great. Thanks so much. I loved hearing that story. So I am a memoirist as well as an associate professor, and one of the things that, as well as a forager, and one of the things that folks don't necessarily know about me is that I grew up in a very working class family. I was raised by a single mother, and also who relied upon the help of her parents. I'm about third or fourth generation Chinese American. But in our household, everybody was working. So during the week, my grandfather worked in a Chinese restaurant and worked in the Chinese restaurant industry his entire life. He worked like restaurant hours, which means that he starts working at around the mid to late afternoon and doesn't get home until midnight. My grandmother was a college-educated bookkeeper, so she kept regular business hours, and my mother was a New York City public school teacher. During the week, everybody was working. It was the 1970s in Queens, so a liberated woman, as my mother was, did not want to be enslaved in the kitchen. Most of our food during the week came out of a box. We did not eat family style, which to me as a Chinese American means that the food is put on the table in massive quantities, and we have all our individual plates and we go and we scoop our food in, right? In my nuclear family with just my single mother and myself, that didn't happen. She did cook all of the meals, but again, most of it came out of the box, and it was the 70s too, so her only interest in cooking was sort of niche, faddish trends. So spinach quiche was a big thing in the 70s, and she also perfected the art of chicken cordon bleu. My grandfather, though, was the one who cooked in the family. He was known as being the cook. He didn't learn to cook when he was in China from his mother. He came over when he was 16, and he learned in this country to cook from the chefs at the Chinese restaurants from which he worked. He himself was a bartender and a manager of Chinese restaurants, and you'll see him, he's here all the way on the left, the very handsome gentleman holding the glass. At the time, he was a bartender. And what he would do is on the one day of the week, on the weekends when he wasn't working, he would wake up really early in the morning at 6 a.m. and start to cook. Everything was about cooking things for many, many, many hours in a slow simmer. So it was all about an investment in time. As I grew up, I really wasn't cognizant of the fact that this may have been unusual, that my grandfather was the one who was cooking for the family, nor did I realize that it was necessarily unusual that we were coming together on the weekends to consume the food that he was providing. He was reticent to say the words, "I love you," to emote those kinds of words, but it definitely came through in the cooking and in the meals and in the investment of time that he made in cooking our meals. This is my family in Flushing, Queens in the 1960s in all their Mad Men glory. My grandmother, my grandfather in the center, and that's my mother. Because my grandmother was a college-educated bookkeeper, she really didn't cook herself. So it was up to my grandfather, the immigrant, working class restaurant worker who had to teach the family, the women in the family, how to cook. So they are making dim sum, like a hagao, which is a shrimp dumpling, right? That white fluffy stuff in front of my grandmother is actually the dough that will become the wrapper to the dumpling. At that time, my grandfather believed in making everything fresh, so it wasn't even store-bought wrappers at that moment for him. Everything had to be be made. And my mother, instead of using a rolling pin to roll out the dough, is actually using my grandfather's Chinese cleaver to do it. And so I remember coming to this table and learning how to cook from my grandfather, who would be sort of like the maestro, and he would put all of the ingredients together, and my grandmother, my mother, and myself would sit around the table and make the dumplings. We did this on a seasonal basis. We did it a lot during Chinese New Year as well. And so it was really from my grandfather that I learned to cook. And I didn't realize then at the time that this was also when a lot of the sort of family culture was being disseminated while we were sitting down, right? And also for me as a third or fourth generation Chinese American, no matter how you, depending on how you look at it, my sense of Chineseness is really rooted in that table, because my grandfather and my grandmother spoke two different dialects of Chinese. My mother spoke no Chinese, but she understood it. I basically, spoke half Chinese, half English until I was 2, and then I lost my language. So the language at the table, the common language that we all spoke, was really the language of food. I definitely have, now that my grandparents have passed away, I definitely have a very nostalgic sense of what this was like, coming together only on those weekends, because the rest of the time everybody was just working, and I really didn't see them very much. Okay, so my grandfather cooked with a lot of things that may have been considered unusual ingredients. A lot of Chinese people believe that your food is your medicine. Right? This is not just specific to Chinese people, right? So for my grandfather, that meant like the best quality ingredients. It didn't necessarily need to be local. He didn't have the idea of locavorism, right? And certainly with shiitake, certain kinds of mushrooms like shiitakes, dried was considered medicinally better, right, than fresh. But he cooked with a lot of ingredients that were, so it's like medicinal herbs, things that were supposed to boost immunity, teas that were supposed to help with different points in a woman's cycle. So I kind of grew up learning all of these things from my grandfather at the table, as well as walking with him through the dusty aisles of Chinese supermarkets, both in Flushing as well as here in Manhattan, Chinatown. One of the ingredients he cooked with was something called cloud ear or wood ear fungus. For the longest time, I had absolutely no idea what these were or where they came from. I only thought they came from Chinese supermarkets, where they looked a lot like shrinky dinks, and then he would reconstitute them in water, and they would become luscious and buoyant. Had no flavor, but it was all about the consistency, and what kind of texture it would add to the meal, as well as he believed that it was an immunity boost. So my grandfather would chop these up and add them to our stir fries and also some of our soups. And it was the greatest pleasure for me as a person who was introduced to wild foods sort of later in life, years after my grandfather passed away, that I was able to find on a walk the wild relative to the cloud ear and wood ear mushrooms that my grandfather used to cook with. Here they are pictured in Prospect Park, Brooklyn. But I've also found them on Staten Island and all throughout the 5 boroughs in the summertime. So there's something about, for me, the family table is actually extended out to the field. And so finding these ingredients makes me feel like I'm still part of my grandfather's, in my grandfather's kitchen. As a forager, I had to, because a lot of the wild edibles that are growing in the tri-state area have a culinary and medicinal profile in other parts of the world. I had to open up my scope and not just be limited to Chinese or Asian cuisine, but take a look at and learn about the cuisines of other cultures. So this is a plant called lamb's quarters. It has gone global. It is related to quinoa, spinach, and beets. And it is a vegetable that is prevalent, that you see, that occurs in Bangladeshi, Persian, and also Greek cuisine. This is lamb's quarters that's gone to seed. And it has, by the way, the distinction of being known as one of the most nutritious plants in the world. So it is kind of a neglected food source that I like to point out to people. In one sort of interesting fact about it is that the seeds of lamb's quarters were actually found in the excavated stomach of an Iron Age man in a bog in Denmark. So lamb's quarters has been eaten since prehistoric times, but for whatever reasons, as Americans, we don't necessarily embrace it. I learned about it through a Corsican friend who, her family loved to create what her grandmother called a wild greens pie or a grass pie. And outside their home on the hillside, they would go and forage for a great variety of wild greens. And so I became inspired by this idea, even though this was not my culinary tradition, but I became so inspired by this, this family Corsican grass pie that I decided to do it in Brooklyn. And so I started to look for things that I could fill this pie up with, and one of them is lamb's quarters. We don't have the same plethora of wild greens as you do in the Mediterranean. However, there is enough, and if I can round out the pie with grass-fed ricotta, it certainly is very tasty. My partner, my husband, is English. And so every year we go out to England. One of the things they like to practice is the idea of what grows together goes together. And this is a plant called garlic mustard, which in the United States is considered a weedy invasive, and the Parks Department likes to pull it out. But in England, it's kept in check by the other weeds. And so I was able to find a whole bunch of it and turn this into a pesto-like sauce that I served for the family with the local lamb that may have grazed on that plant. So this was very popular with even my mother-in-law. This is a picture of my daughter. She is 2.5 years old. We have taught her how to forage, and this is in England, and she's foraging for wild blackberries. She loved the blackberries so much we had difficulty extracting her from the patch. And last but not least, foraging has been come up a lot in the media eye. Recently, I did a photo shoot with the fashion website Refinery 29, which most of my students knew. I wasn't really that aware of it. But I was able to, this was very recently in Prospect Park, I climbed a tree to get these chicken of the woods mushrooms, which is an edible mushroom that grows throughout the summer and the early part of the fall, like now. Luckily, one thing you can't see is that I'm actually standing on the shoulders of the writer. That tree is that stump is about 10 feet tall. So that's sort of one of the hidden things. And one of the great pleasures was an hour after picking those mushrooms, Alice Waters and Carla Petrini were in town for the 25th anniversary of Slow Foods. And one of my greatest achievements was Alice Waters actually accepted those chicken of the woods mushrooms and said she was going to cook them up that weekend. So that's just a picture of me just not believing that I'm actually there with Alice Waters. Anyway, so that's just sort of the end of the presentation. So I just wanted to show you the ways in which we have been incorporating food into our family meals and sort of broadening out from just sort of the Chinese cuisine that I grew up with and embracing other cuisines of other cultures now that our family has just expanded. So, thank you.
So before I open up the conversation at the table, I want to ask you, how many of you, please just raise your hand, actually grew up eating a family meal, say 5 times a week? Okay. Well, that's an amazingly large number. Okay. So let me throw this open to the group. So much of what you have all talked about has been about food and identity. So do you think that the meal itself, the family meal, is the place where cultural identity is passed on? Or are there other things? And what about the idea of the actual cooking of the meal as the time that the civilization is passed from person to person? And that's why they say that women are the keepers of the civilization. Or have we lost that through women's liberation and all of those other issues? And do we now go out to eat and sit around and have family meals at restaurants? And does it have to have been cooked at home? So,
Well, the cooking part, for me, it's actually more important than the consumption part because my mother, I was growing up in the 60s and she wanted to be a mother woman, and so she made sure that she would teach the same things to me and my sisters, which was not very well accepted by the rest of the family, by the way. Especially my grandmother was completely horrified by the fact that I was in the kitchen. And but for me, the cultural transmission.
how did your sisters take it, and what did you
It was
think about it?
just the way it was.
Okay.
It was. But for me, the cultural transmissions happened more in the kitchen than in the living room. I mean, once we were all together consuming, yes, of course, there are some values that are transmitted, but the materiality of my food culture and who I am, as a physical person was really shaped in the kitchen. And I realized that when I came here as an immigrant, cooking for me was more important than eating Italian food. I could go anywhere to eat Italian food, also good food now. It didn't satisfy that nostalgia, that need to be myself. I had to cook and possibly feed somebody else. So I realized that it was not only the techniques, knowing how to do things, but also the fact that, that care work, that making food for others had been transmitted in the kitchen. So at least for me personally, I think that cooking is a very, very important part. And I think, historically, culturally, that's very often the case. I mean, who's in the kitchen, who's outside? And entering that realm can be complicated. I mean, I've done some research in Brazil, for instance, and I was trying to learn how to make dishes from the women cooking in my sort of posada, a little hotel. And at first they were looking at me like, who is this white male and what is he doing in our kitchen? And I said, it was very clear that for them, the cultural identity was not so much to cook and then give me the food. For them, the problem was for me to be in the kitchen and work with them. And so I had sort of to befriend them and then convince them that whatever we would cook will be shared among all the workers in the hotel. So again, for me, the cooking part is very important, but I also realized that it's very complicated. I mean, nowadays, and maybe, Krishnendu and Ava having children, how do you do that in the sort of rhythm of life we have now?
So what do you think?
With the cooking and being a parent, I gotta say, once I became a parent, my connection with cooking did become. It is different. I feel it now more. What used to be a total pleasure because I wasn't required to do it, can sometimes be like a tyranny of the kitchen, in the sense that my kid needs to eat on a schedule. Like it's the bells hit 6 6 p.m. and she needs to eat, she starts screaming. I am not so prepared that I often have our entire family meal together by 6 o'clock. So half the time, I have to admit, she's eating before we are. Sometimes, yeah. Anyway, so there's that, and it's a problem. But I'll tell you that there are certain meals that I've had that have really taught me about myself as well as individual family members. So in the springtime, one of the first wild edibles that comes up are the morel mushrooms, right? And the morels, if any of you have ever had them, they're fantastic. Science hasn't figured out how to cultivate morel mushrooms quite yet. So the only way you can get them is in the wild, or you can pay a nice hefty price in the farmers markets, right? So I went out and I found, a friend showed me his secret spot within city limits, and we were able to find like 200 morel mushrooms. And I have to say, to preface this by saying, it took me about, I was looking for these morel mushrooms for about an entire month. And I couldn't find any. And then we found this spot where we found 200 morel mushrooms. It was like, it was like one of those jackpot aha moments. And I had invited my mother to come over for Mother's Day to have this meal with us. And I was introducing her to my then boyfriend, who became my husband. And this was a way that I thought we could all get together in the same way that my grandfather would bring us all together by his meal, except that I was going to the nth degree by actually, instead of foraging in the Chinese supermarkets, I had actually gone out into the field and brought them back, right? But my mother, who is not a forager, who likes to eat food, but really doesn't care that much, which is why, there's a lot of stuff from the box, and the boxes are convenient. I sometimes use boxed food too, but not that much. And I try not to admit it. But anyway, so I invited her over for the meal, and she basically rushed right through the entire process and didn't understand all the elements that went into that meal. And for a moment, I felt like there was this role reversal. You know how, sometimes parents say to, oh, you're ungrateful, this and that. And that's really how I felt about my mom at that moment. And then I realized, well, she's never actually searched for our own food. So she doesn't really know what that's all about. This is something that I've kind of taken up and embraced, and it's part of my identity that's different from her. And one of the things that I realized is that in order to, if I expected my mother to be any different and to appreciate the meal the way that I did, rather, if I expected my mother to appreciate the meal the way I did, it was expecting her to be different than who she was. And there was something about cooking up this meal for her that gave me a kind of a deeper understanding about who we were as women, as well as moms and individuals. So.
You have.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. So going back to the first part of your question about food as a driver and marker of cultural identity, I wonder if it depends very much on the culture of origin. And some groups, some ethnic groups, some cultures are more food-centric, food-obsessed even, food-defined than others. So none of us was surprised to hear Fabio talking about his relationship to the kitchen and cooking and the family Sunday meal. And likewise in my case, coming from a Jewish family where we coded all of our memories and experiences through food, and every holiday, every meal had its symbolic foods and its rituals. So it was very explicitly a way to convey, perpetuate, and mark cultural identity and heritage for us. Whereas when I would visit maybe my Irish Catholic friend or or others in the neighborhood whose cultural backgrounds were not as food-centric, the cuisines may not have been as defined, and other activities took a bigger place in shaping family activities and family life. it might have not been as strong a connection. To Fabio's question about how important is it, what the locus of the meal, does that matter? Does it have to be home cooked and eaten in the home versus eaten out? There too, I think it depends on the culture and the time. So back in 1970s, suburban South Jersey, though we ate most of our meals at home and they were home cooked, I practically lived for our occasional meals out, often in so-called ethnic restaurants, which in the 1970s at the time was an act of exploration. It was unusual, and we got to eat Szechuan food and Indian food and Japanese food, including sushi, and that was a further marker of cultural identity as a family that sought out and embraced these other kinds of experiences. And then as far as what comes after the transmission of or reinforcement of cultural identity, there's the question of cultural bonding and the community and commensality and relationships forged through food, expressed through cultural traditions. And a favorite experience of mine in the last few years came about when I was meeting my now fiance's daughter for the first time. And Stuart had warned me that she had only left the terrible twos 2 years previously, which was worrisome because she was 17 at the time. And sure enough, our first couple meetings didn't go so well. And I thought it would be a good decade before we had a relationship. Well, somehow or other, she accepted an invitation out to a place I have in the country in Shelter Island. And I invited her into the kitchen to cook with me, and it was a skill she wanted to develop and hadn't really. And the way we developed a relationship and communication and trust and cultural connection in the kitchen over the saute pan and then subsequently over the table, it didn't hurt that we let a 17-year-old drink wine at dinner. I think that opened up a lot too. But it was this, to be beautiful example, and it completely accelerated and deepened a relationship. So it's that intermingling of transmitting cultural identity, but also using food to forge bonds.
This is something quick to say on it conceptually, which is, I think, the question of identity. For us, it was, of course, situational, but I think taste and talk. Talk being language, because linguistic difference was crucial. And taste and talk figured through the principle of difference. That is, I realized I was something because I didn't eat something, or I ate something, and I realized I was something because I talked something some ways, and I didn't talk in other ways. So India, of course, is in some ways continental in its scope, so you identified with languages almost the size of European nations, in fact. Orissa, the state I come from, has about 50 million people. So 50 million people speak Odia, which is more than Italian, or pretty close to it. And Bengali is, of course, 200 million, which is 3 times the number of German speakers in the world. And so taste and talk, and the principle of difference. So depending on where I went, it's the difference that kind of would reassert through taste and talk. And of course, unrelated, but overlaid on phenotype, what I looked and what other people looked.
So I want to open this up to all of you. Just at a little administrative point, we're trying to keep this so that everyone can hear it and so that it's properly recorded. So if you have a question, you can go to one of the mics, or one of the people will pass the mics around. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. Does anybody? There's a question right over here.
Hello. I wanted to bring this back to the restaurant point and whether family meals have to occur at home or outside. And I think this was addressed about whether cooking the meal is what matters or whether it's the time spent together. But I would like to pontificate, or I'd want you guys to pontificate about the role of space and whether it's important that this occurs in a private home versus in a public area. Like, does that change the entire experience of what it means to have a family meal if there's a chance of outside observers, or the sense of ownership, like this is my home and this is my meal.
Quick response is until I was maybe 15 years old, 18 years old, you'd have asked me what's the best meal I had. I would have never mentioned my mother's cooking. Now I do. That's nostalgia. I would have said our 2 meals in a year we ate in a small town named Cuttack, which is a palindrome. You can go in either direction. Cuttack. And the 2 restaurants were called Hong Kong and Waldorf. And they served Chinese food, which is Indian Chinese food. I thought, and I still think, is the best damn food I've had in my life. And it was the most beautiful family moment. That was aspirational for us, a family of 4. That was the only, we could eat out twice in a year, and we ate out twice in a year. And I think nothing made us more a family than eating in Hong Kong and Waldorf, in Cuttack, in Odisha.
For us, and I think it's also, more general, we would have also different sizes of family. And that depends also, as Meryl was pointing out, on your, background. So there were occasions where there was the nuclear family, and then the close family, and then 20 people, and then 40 people. But all of them had different sort of degrees of creating bonding and defining spaces and our identity. I remember these sort of summer cookout that we would have. We would make something called arrosticini. They are tiny skewers of lamb and sheep meat cooked on the grill. And the fun part was not only cooking, actually grilling them, but cutting the meat in little pieces and putting them together with friends and family. So it didn't really matter where we were, but what we were doing around the food and preparing the dinner was part of it. So I think there are also different spheres and different realms in which this can happen. And I think depending on your culture, the nuclear family can be more important or the larger one. Probably in certain cultures in Africa, the larger one is much more important than the small one. So I think that's also very contextual.
I'll just add that since my grandparents have passed away, and for me, they were the model of Chineseness, even though their sense of their real Chineseness was sort of a Chineseness that's caught in time, because my grandfather came over when he was 16, worked in Chinese restaurants his whole life. So if he went back to China, he would not necessarily feel as Chinese, I think. He was a special kind of Chinese, right? And so now that those folks have passed away, one of the things, the way I feel and the way I'm able to practice the limited Cantonese that I have is to go and have dim sum, and that's always a raucous family affair, right? You're surrounded by other families, and actually the best thing about it was having a young child. Nobody cares if she's screaming, right? Because all the other, people are very happy to smile at the kid. So I feel like there's situations like that where, sort of it's an extension of the family table. We don't have to be in our kitchen. I can no longer be in my grandparents' kitchen, but we can kind of recreate that wherever it is that we are.
Any other questions? Oh, I'm sorry. Go on.
So I think another dimension to that is maybe the real distinction between eating as a family in the home versus out is one might shape meaning and the other shape memory in a different way. That a quotidian act, eating in the same kitchen in the home day in and day out, lays down a foundation, but one that flows, one day into the next without as many discrete memories associated with it. And each restaurant meal, particularly if you're not returning to the same restaurant on each restaurant going occasion, is an opportunity for a strong discrete memory around which will swirl other family connectors. I think there is a home cooking parallel to that, looking at the quotidian, the everyday meal, and the holiday meal, the festive meal that has, you know, more rituals, more etiquette, more symbolic foods associated with it, but because they tend to recur on a simply annual or, you know, sometimes more frequent basis, you're more likely to remember those occasions uniquely and distinctly.
So what we remember depends on what we forget.
Yes.
That's true. Any other questions?
As I listen to this, many movies and plays start going through my head because often the climax or the big tension is set in the dining room. And I'm wondering, is that because the director can put everybody in a small space? Or is there something about the family that things that happen in the dining room that do not happen in the living room or the backyard, or something about the dining experience of the intimacy of it that brings out all kinds of resentments or emotions or whatever? Does anyone have a comment on that?
That's a very good question. I think from the practical point of view, yes. I mean, interactions around food are easy to film because people are positioned in ways that the camera can work more easily than maybe they're around the swimming pool. I mean, you have different effects, of course, but that's very important. But I do think that filmmakers are aware of the fact that there are tensions, maybe, or sometimes affections around the table that maybe do not express themselves the same way in other environments. And plus, that's the place where more than 2 or 3 people can be together and interact. You know, you can have the whole family. You can have them in front of the TV all together, but they're probably not really interacting with each other because they're busy with the TV. So I think there are practical reasons behind that frequency of dining scenes, but also the reflection on actual dynamics that allow to have an entry point into that family or couple or groups of friends. I mean, I always remember the scene in The Big Chill, right, where they're preparing the dinner. That's very symptomatic of their relationships. By seeing them preparing the meal and the way they interacted with each other, you knew more or less some elements of the characters. And
I think if we were open-minded about group sex, food would not be that important. That's the other appetite, you can't show it. It's about socializing and containing appetites. If we are more open-minded about group sex, food would not be that important in movies.
that's a good observation.
And of course, that stopped the conversation.
Yes.
Any other questions? Does anybody else have any questions? Yes.
Just from my life experience, from my background, I've noticed that the act of hospitality, where you're bringing strangers or your community into your house, is a way of strengthening, your community. And I've noticed with this move to more private eating, even if it's on a nuclear family, does that affect the strength of the community? And also, does the act of family eating or the act of eating, can that strengthen immigrant communities? Was that like a clear question?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Does anybody have comment?
Well, hospitality, in a way, also reinforces, the idea of generosity. So we are a group, we are a family, and again, it's it can be at different scales, where being open to the others is an important factor. But that, in most cultures that's the case, and in some cultures, the sacrality of the guest is more relevant than in others. I found myself, I don't know, many years ago when you could travel in Syria during Ramadan, and I was invited to eat one evening because it was just unthinkable that in one dinner of Ramadan, I was by myself. I didn't know these people. So it was not like they were creating a bond with me. They were sort of reaffirming their identity as Muslims celebrating Ramadan. So I think it might depend, on the dynamics and what's the general culture
I
around.
think it's the crucial point of hospitality is who does not get invited. That marks the community. I come from a country of caste.
Yeah, true.
Well, that makes me think of the question of Thanksgiving and the tendency to invite extra people to Thanksgiving because they don't have anywhere to go or anything like that. And it sounds exactly like the situation that you were in. Does anybody have special Thanksgiving memories or Thanksgiving? We have this as a national holiday, which is, many national holidays have food, whether it's Christmas or, what is it, 4th of July or whatever, where people are eating certain things, and there are other holidays that have food. And yet this one is really a totally secular holiday. It's not one that's been based on other religious forebears or anything like that, and yet it also has to do with food. And it has great mythology and all sorts of things that people love to dispute and whatever. So what do you think about that? And as immigrants, how have you adapted to Thanksgiving? That to me is an interesting question too.
Well, I've learned how to make, some of the American classics. I've learned how to make the turkey, the succotash, the collard greens with the ham hock and all that stuff. At the same time, I like also to put something, to offer something from my culture. So I started playing with ingredients, and I came up with the idea of making gnocchi with sweet potatoes, but season them with bacon and apples. So it's sort of the theme of the season, but it was also, gnocchi, which is my culture. But besides that, I've grown to like Thanksgiving precisely for this idea of, gathering people around the table just because there is the possibility of doing it, somehow the theater of the abundance and the sharing. So it's become a holiday that I really enjoy, at least personally.
And I think it's certainly the ultimate emblem of a holiday that's iconic in its food traditions and practices shared nationwide on the same day, but also one that's unusually fraught. Talk about the tyranny of the Thanksgiving table and the expectations and family dynamics that play out. And for me, some of my most treasured Thanksgivings have been the ones that have broken the boundaries. So either as a child, when I would introduce a course called Bastia, the Moroccan dish, as one of the elements in an otherwise very traditional American Thanksgiving menu, and because that was eaten communally by hand from a large platter in the center of the table, it brought people together symbolically in ways that simply having our plates and our places and our discrete plates might not have. My other favorite Thanksgivings have been spent abroad in countries that haven't adapted a Thanksgiving tradition. So being a little bit of an outsider to that holiday has been very enjoyable. So to me, my Thanksgiving equivalent is more the Passover Seder, another meal with strong food traditions and symbolism, celebrated the world over at the same time, but not by, of course, a smaller and different group, and the act of inviting into our home people who didn't come from a Passover celebrating tradition is always one of the real joys and highlights, sharing that experience, and the excitement, curiosity, and gratitude of those guests was, you know, I have friends who talk about it years and years and years later.
I'm going to say something misanthropic, so
Thanksgiving in my family was always a little fraught because it was the one big family meal that my grandfather didn't cook. I have extended members in our family that I have an Irish-American aunt who was out on Long Island, didn't cook very much, but she always insisted on cooking the Thanksgiving meal. And this always irked my grandfather because the turkey, we always prize, like with chicken, the dark meat chicken versus the white meat chicken. My grandfather never understood why white meat and the breast of the turkey was such a big deal. And my aunt, unfortunately, would always overcook the turkey. So my grandfather always, at the end of the meal, as we were going home, would always be like angry and hungry. So the only ways that things started to change actually was when my aunt started to get it catered. That's when everything turned around because the meal was actually tastier than what she could provide on the table. So that's some of my Thanksgiving memories.
I personally find it unbearable, both in terms of national and religious propaganda machineries, any community you belong in. Really, it's intolerable. I just do it because I'm part of this social world, so I have to do it. But I find the pressure just unbearable. I said I was going to be misanthropic.
And so, with that, if no one else has any questions, I'm going to thank all of you, thank the wonderful panel, and hope that you go away with some interesting thoughts to keep talking about.